welcome back to my channel where we're making common sense rigorous. I'm doing something a little bit different today. I'm going to be talking about Dr. Norman Geisler, who died a few years ago. He was a well-known, very strong traditional inerrantist. The content I'm giving you today in this format is content that I've provided before in other formats. I wrote a blog post about it several years back when this issue first arose. And then recently I put a post on Facebook. But for those of you who follow this YouTube channel or the audio podcast, I wanted to make the same material available in these formats because I think it's really important in fairness to Dr. Geisler's memory. Even though I'm not a traditional inerrantist, and doubtless there would have been things that he and I would have disagreed about. Now, the question at issue here that I'm addressing concerns whether Dr. Geisler was inconsistent with his own principles. As is well known, Geisler very explicitly rejected all of the fact-changing literary device claims that were made by Michael Licona. And he was very overt about it, very well known for it, in saying that the gospel authors didn't do these things. Shortly after Dr. Geisler died, there was a dialogue between Richard Howe and Michael Licona. And the moderator was Frank Turek. I'm going to try to find the link to that and put that in the show notes. At a certain point in that dialogue, Dr. Licona read out a short passage and then asked Richard Howe to guess who had written the short passage. And then it was this big reveal. It was written by Geisler and Howe, this being his brother, Thomas Howe, were co-authors in a book that they wrote about gospel contradictions. And this was supposed to be kind of a gotcha because Dr. Licona interpreted it that Geisler and Howe were saying that Matthew changed the day of the temple cleansing in Passion Week. So that even he knew it was on Monday, but changed it knowingly to Sunday. And in that dialogue, I thought Richard Howe did fine, and he actually made the distinction that I've referred to as the distinction between achronological narration and dyschronological narration. He didn't use that terminology, but this is what he was getting at. Now, what's been interesting to me is that Dr. Licona has gone on from that, and even though I immediately posted something saying, no, I think it's very, very implausible to read Geisler as saying that Matthew changed the day of the temple cleansing, and the achronological, dyschronological distinction applies here. And there was plenty of time later for Licona to rethink. He's gone on just making that claim completely unqualified. No, maybe there's another interpretation of Geisler or nothing like that. Just Geisler did the same thing that I've done. And he says it in his new 2024 book, Jesus Contradicted. Geisler does the same thing that I do, and it's ironic that Geisler was so opposed, etc. But we caught him doing the same thing he said he was opposed to, is the idea. Dr. Licona said it equally unqualified recently on his interview with Tim Stratton. Tim Stratton obviously believed that. He's like, oh, and now he was doing the same thing, repeating it back to Licona. So it's going out there. It's just this unquestioned thing that, we've caught Geisler advocating the idea that the gospel author knowingly changed the facts, even though he's supposedly opposed to that. And I think there's a real question about whether he advocated that at all. The prior is very low because Geisler was so self-conscious about that kind of thing, so clear, so definite, that the gospel authors didn't do anything like that, that you have to wonder, is there some other interpretation available? I mean, if anything, Geisler was nothing if not self-conscious and consistent. That's part of what he gets blamed for, because he was, so, shall we say, adamant in his defense of traditional inerrancy. And that's supposed to mean, such a rigid, mean guy and so forth. So there's something weird about this. I'm also not a big fan of that kind of gotcha thing where you read a quote, you don't say who it is, and then you go, guess who that is, and you kind of, it's like you spring it on the person. I'm just not a big fan of that either. What I want to do here is I want to read you the whole passage, not very long, from Geisler and Thomas Howe's book on Bible difficulties. I got this from Defending Inerrancy, but it's taken from that book. This is the same thing that Dr. Licona read part of, and I want to read it. And then I want to talk about why I think another interpretation is better. All right, so they state it as problem, solution. Problem. Matthew places the cursing of the fig tree after the cleansing of the temple, but Mark places the cursing before the temple was cleansed. But it cannot be both. Did one gospel writer make a mistake? And of course, this would also apply to if one gospel writer changed the facts deliberately as well, all the more so. Solution. Jesus actually cursed the fig tree on his way to the temple, as Mark said, but this does not mean that Matthew's account is mistaken. Christ made 2 trips to the temple, and he cursed the fig tree on his second trip. Mark 11:11 says that Christ entered the temple the day of his triumphal entry. When Christ enters the temple, Mark does not mention Christ making any proclamations against any wrongdoing. Verse 12 says, now the next day, referring to the trip to the fig tree on the way to the temple on the second day. So that would be Monday. On this day, Christ threw out those buying and selling in the temple. Matthew, however, addresses the 2 trips of Christ to the temple as though they were one event. This gives the impression that the first day Christ entered the temple, he drove out the buyers and sellers as well. Mark's account, however, gives more detail to the events, revealing that there were actually 2 trips to the temple. In view of this, we have no reason to believe that there is a discrepancy in the accounts. Okay, now to avoid any confusion, I want to emphasize this is a different question from the question of whether Jesus cleansed the temple twice, where there's supposedly a conflict between John and the synoptics. This is something different. This is about the day of the week within Passion Week, the cleansing at the end of his ministry. And I don't know of anybody who suggests that he cleansed the temple twice in Passion Week, right before his death. So this is about whether he cleansed the temple on Monday or on Tuesday, on Sunday or on Monday, in Passion Week at the end of his ministry. All right. Now, you can see right there that the phrase, and this is what Licona read, Matthew, however, addresses the 2 trips of Christ to the temple as though they were one event. So that's the bit that Licona's taking, and he's saying, see, Geisler does the same thing. That Geisler is supposedly saying that Matthew, made this into one event and put it on the Sunday, even though Matthew knew that really there was a visit to the temple there on the Sunday. Then he went out, and then he came back and cursed the fig tree and so forth on the Monday, and cleansed the temple after that cursing. So one could read it that way. Now, I'm not saying that if you take this passage from Geisler and Howe completely in isolation of who's writing it and so forth, that it could not be read that way. But I do think that when you know a lot about somebody and they've been, absolutely clear and adamant, and of course, Howe is a co-writer I suppose he might have drafted this passage, but let's take it that he and Geisler were of one mind on the issue of fact changing by the authors. Then you have to ask yourself, are we reading this right? Because it's a kind of a short passage. I would suggest that a better reading is that the phrase addresses the 2 trips of Christ to the temple as though they were one event, is just referring to the initial impression you would get, which Matthew is accidentally giving. That Matthew's sort of accidentally giving that impression. So it says, gives the impression that the first day Christ entered the temple, he drove out the buyers and sellers as well. Okay, but that just means you could get the impression from it. Not that Matthew was saying, I'm going to try to give this impression that he cleansed the temple right there on that Sunday, even though I know it wasn't like that. I don't think that that's the best way to read it, especially since it says that Mark's account, reveals that there were actually 2 trips. And also, I think we should notice that Geisler and Howe would never have used the word discrepancy in the odd way that Dr. Licona uses it, where he says that something doesn't count as a discrepancy anymore if there is a compositional device. Now that's a very confused use of the word discrepancy. In fact, when there's one of these compositional devices, that, as I've mentioned before, it fixes the discrepancy in place. So if we talk about the temple cleansing early in Jesus' ministry in John and then late in Jesus' ministry, you're not getting rid of the discrepancy if you insist there was only one and John moved it. You're actually saying there is a discrepancy because John's putting the one and only temple cleansing early in Jesus' ministry, so that they're in conflict, but you're just dubbing that a compositional device. You would never find Geisler saying that there isn't a discrepancy in the accounts. He takes himself to be harmonizing them. This is supposed to be a harmonization, a traditional harmonization. Now, another reason to read this in the way I've just suggested concerns the absence in modern scholarship of a clear and consistent and widely used vocabulary for referring to these things. I'm not saying that the concept of achronological narration is like something that I've first introduced, but I would say that I'm one of the first people to introduce a terminology, achronological and dyschronological. So you get this from my earlier video on 4 ways of narrating time. Achronological narration arises when the author is not intending to convey a chronology. So you might accidentally read him to be conveying a chronology, but that's not his intention. And dyschronological narration is when the author is intending to convey a chronology and in fact is intending to change the chronology from what he knows was real to something that he knows is not real. And before people start saying, oh, you're putting this in the intention of the authors, well, the literary device theorists are putting tons of things in the intention of the authors. Oh, it was their intention to use such and such a compositional device. It was their intention to write in this special genre and so forth. So, we should all be able to talk about the intention of the authors. And I think that this is an important distinction between an intention to not give a chronology and just to write in a kind of a general way and an intention to give one. The fact that there was no widely consistently used terminology of this kind at the time that Geisler and Howe wrote, and still isn't today, because I haven't, succeeded in getting everybody to use these terms and always to be super clear. There were often misunderstandings between modern scholars. I can give other examples. In fact, I'll try to link a paper that I wrote that gives several examples of this kind, where there's just unclarity, and I think some scholars are talking past one another and so forth. So it's not surprising, especially in view of the fact that this is a kind of a brief treatment, that it should be somewhat unclear. So those are three considerations. First of all, the clarity elsewhere of Geisler's thoughts on these matters and his definiteness and consistency everywhere else, that the gospel authors did not change facts. Secondly, the brevity of what's written here, because it's a whole book of Bible difficulties, so you're not going to take a long time in each one. And then thirdly, the absence of a well agreed upon terminology that enables scholars to just, immediately say, oh, by the way, what I mean by this is that Matthew accidentally gives this impression. Matthew is narrating achronologically. He wasn't intending to give this impression. Now, I'm not advocating that harmonization. I'm going to be clear here. As followers of this channel know, I'm not an inerrantist. I think the harmonization that I'm attributing to Geisler and Howe is somewhat strained. I think when you read Matthew, it doesn't look like he's doing a chronological narration. But the fact that I don't adopt that harmonization doesn't mean that Geisler and Howe don't adopt that harmonization. And it doesn't mean that the most charitable reading is to take them to be advocating a fact-changing literary device when, that was something they were completely opposed to. So we got to distinguish that. Possibly the reason, or one cause, for Dr. Licona's just being so definite that they're advocating a fact-changing device here is that he thinks it would be far-fetched or strained to take Matthew to be writing achronologically. But that's not really important. In fact, Dr. Licona often says that traditional harmonizers, traditional inerrantists, are advocating strained harmonizations. So from his perspective, to say that Geisler and Howe are advocating achronological narration as a harmonization of Matthew and Mark, it's just one more strained harmonization, as he would look at it. So why not say that? Or why not at least offer that as an option? I'm also somewhat disturbed by the fact that this claim only began to be made in public after Dr. Geisler's death. I found it impossible thus far to get in touch directly with Thomas Howe due to his health, is my understanding. So, he may not be in a position to address this, and Dr. Geisler has passed away and had passed away just a few months before that dialogue that I mentioned between Richard Howe and Licona. So he can't speak to this. But I think at a minimum, this other interpretation should be raised as a very real possibility. And I think in fairness to Dr. Geisler's memory, what Dr. Licona and his followers should do is suggest this as a possibility. They don't have to adopt it. I think that is what Geisler and Howe mean here. That Matthew's narrating a chronological narration. You could accidentally get the impression that he's putting the temple cleansing on the Sunday, but you realize you correct that initial impression when you read Mark. By the way, I am all in favor in general of being willing to correct initial impressions, and I've said that before. Your initial impression of what an author's saying shouldn't be set in stone and not subject to correction when you get further information. In this case, I'm more inclined to think that Matthew actually made a good faith error, that he, was intending to actually correct Mark, if indeed Mark wrote first and Matthew was aware, but that Mark is more likely to be right. So I'm just going for a good faith error as the most probable thing. But I think they are going for a chronological narration by Matthew gives an accidentally incorrect initial impression. Then you should correct that accidentally incorrect initial impression when you read Mark. If you're out there and you're talking about this, I don't care who you are, and you're going to feel like saying, well, and Geisler did the same thing, And there he was giving Licona such a hard time about, John shifting the temple cleansing. Well, he said that Matthew shifted the temple cleansing. Stop a moment and consider at least saying, when I read that short entry on this apparent discrepancy in Geisler and Howe's book, it looks to me like they're advocating the idea that Matthew actually changed the day of the temple cleansing to Sunday, knowingly. But it is also possible, and it would fit more with their other positions, that they are advocating that Matthew just gave that impression just by the way he narrates and didn't intend to give that impression, and that then that is corrected when we put it together with Mark, and that's a traditional harmonization. And then if you want, you can go on and say, I think that's a very strained harmonization. I think that's a pretty strained harmonization. That's not the point, though. We want to interpret correctly, and in fairness, at least qualify it. Don't just go around, sort of chuckling that, oh, how ironic, we've caught Geisler doing the same thing that he was so opposed to, because the situation is more nuanced than that. And there is another, I think, sufficiently plausible interpretation of the passage that it at least deserves to be mentioned. So that is my recommendation. Next time, I'm probably going to be talking about D.A. Carson on the question of Johannine idiom. And I think that's important. We need to get Carson right there, that he's not advocating the idea that John put his own words in Jesus' mouth in the sense of no longer having recognizable paraphrase. I think Carson is very definite that it was still recognizable, even as far as the occasion was concerned, that Jesus said things on a particular occasion. I'll say more about that next time around. For right now, I'm just challenging you to get Dr. Geisler right on Matthew and the temple cleansing. Thanks for watching. Please come back to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.